mentioning of the organization that's represented here, David Dodson headed that organization for a number of years, and this is the Sanford School, and I'm sure they know, but the rest of you may not know that organization that they're involved with and running was founded by Terry Sanford as part of a program. Terry envisioned that there would be this organization, the North Carolina Fund, would have a lifetime of 5 years, but it would go out of business, and if it started things that were worthwhile, they would continue on their own, and that's how that organization. It's now 20-some years in existence.
Mm-hmm.
It's more than that. How old is it?
55.
55 years. Wow. I mean, which gives you some sense of the breadth of vision of someone like Terry Sanford. In any event, welcome. It's great to have you all here and everyone else. It's a great pleasure to have Rapson back again. You all know that he is the most frequently invited member of the team of speakers at these seminars, and the reason is that as you can tell, you can just look at him and see the radiance there that it comes from what he's doing. He was in Minneapolis before coming to Detroit in 2006 to head up the Kresge Foundation. And if you look back to that point and then look forward to what happened with the Grand Bargain in there, the reason that the Grand Bargain could take place in Detroit was because of the groundwork that Rip Rapson led over the course of the time from he got there in 2006. The Grand Bargain was something like 2017, 18, when was it?
2013.
2013. So 7 years of groundwork building. He is an extraordinary philanthropist, open to ideas across the board. I don't know, I'm sure I asked him this before. One of the former people involved in co-teaching my class, Tony Procio, writes his books for him, and give Tony my regards. In any event, Rip, it's an honor to have you back. It's exciting for me to have you back. For those people who haven't heard you before, it's going to be doubly exciting. And there's no other speaker we have who arrives with anything like this. Usually you don't get anything. You just get the verbal talk. Here you get not only the verbal talk, but you get something illustrative. It's really original thinking and really laid out right in before you. So you're on.
Well, thank you, Joel. I don't need to tell this group what a privilege it is to sit next to this guy. This is one of the most remarkable stories of history of American philanthropy, sitting right next to me and influencing your life. So just such a privilege and pleasure to be here, and just a person of the first rank. About the coloring book, this could be a distraction if we're not careful. What you'll find is, particularly for those of you online, is that often the details are so small as to be incomprehensible. So don't try to comprehend them. I think we're going to try to move through the drawings largely as sort of illustrative of larger themes. And you can always go back and look for folks in the room who have it, or those online, we can get it to you. But it is sort of both, it's an advantage if there is really no substance there in the talk. You can always fall back on the drawings, and if the drawings intrigue you, all the better.
You can actually read them on the big screens here.
Oh my gosh.
On our big screen.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. Did I do this? No.
Yeah.
Let me go back. Can I go back, Cassie? How do I do that?
Yes. One more. There you go.
There I go. Okay. Well, let me just start by saying that unlike the past times I've been here, I'm not going to talk too much about Detroit today. You'll see next time, and you'll see implicated in a lot of these examples coming out of the city of Detroit. But what what I will hearken back to is a concept of the role philanthropy can play in community change. And it just seemed to me that in this period when you've got the CARES Act and ARPA and infrastructure and the Inflation Reduction Act, there is such a cascade of federal activity, federal resources, trying to reach community, that it would be a really interesting proposition just to ask whether philanthropy has a role. You know, our dollars are relatively limited, and our reach is often relatively limited. And so I think there's sort of a really interesting question that in the light of trillions of dollars spread across multiple functions and jurisdictions, whether there is really a case to be made that philanthropy ought to lean in and try to be helpful. And the answer I've come to is yes. You may come to a different conclusion, and I'm really interested, given this audience, to open up that conversation and see. So let me do three things. One, reinforce how very, very complex this current capital environment is. Two, try to suggest that there are some traditional roles that philanthropy has played, particularly in Detroit, particularly in Kresge, that I think help us make some sense of that complexity. And three, then open it up for your reflections, because I think there is an argument to be made that I'm coloring outside the lines a little bit. So let me begin by just reminding us all of the extraordinary aspiration that the federal government, and the Biden administration in particular, has articulated for its tenure. The work that it has done on climate already, but certainly as manifested in the Infrastructure Reduction Act and all of the incentives to environmental stewardship, is extraordinary and unprecedented. The work that they're trying to do across all of their functions on racial equity and racial justice and racial reconciliation have been codified in executive orders and have been pushed into cabinet meetings and down into department directives. Economic rebuilding, the president just today talked about the possibility of really making huge progress, both in terms of healing the country from its setbacks during COVID and moving forward into a different, more transformational era. And then obviously we're still trying to recover from the pandemic. I mean, I think even though we're not wearing masks and even though we seem to be going about life as usual, I think we all understand how very complicated that has been and will continue to be. And what's so interesting is that each of these four aspirations has been accompanied by money, because ultimately budgets are moral documents. They speak to our values. And I think what this, and I'm not trying to be an apologist for this administration, forgive me, but I think what this administration is trying to do is to put its money where its values are. And so the idea of trying to understand whether these high-level aspirations actually hit the ground in a way that advance equity, advance racial justice, advance more equitable and forward-looking climate policy, all of those questions, it seems to me, are really the burning platform. And if so, how do we come to terms with it? But translating those aspirations and that machinery to ground level is just almost incomprehensibly complex, and I'll talk about that in just a sec. But it's designed that way. It's supposed to be complex. It is both because we have sort of segregated out functions by discipline. It's because we have created different layers of government. It is because we value the pluralistic way that we make decision-making in this country. So for those of you who don't think these dollar flows are complex, sorry. Try that. This may well be the nuttiest drawing I've ever done, but it's a little bit to a purpose. The complexity is impossible to capture, and I've here just sort of taken a couple of examples of the ARPA monies and the infrastructure monies. But if you start at the very top, the first layer of complexity becomes immediately apparent. We've got not only different programs, ARPA and infrastructure and everything else, you've got all of these different federal agencies, all of which have different subject matter, all of which have different regulatory structures, all of which have very different histories, very different standing within the federal government. You then have different kinds of programs. If you look at the yellow, the three little yellow buckets there, you've got pass-through monies, you've got categorical monies, you've got competitive monies. Every one of those is rigged up differently. Treasury has to pass judgment on them. OMB has to pass judgment on them. It's extraordinarily complex. So you have all of these federal agencies, all with different programs, pushing different kinds of money down, and then you hit the states. And oh my gosh, does that get complicated. And I don't need to tell people in North Carolina how complicated this can be. I mean, just think of the sort of the red state, blue state complexities. I've worked a little bit in Jackson, Mississippi, and tracking the challenges they've had trying to deal with their water issues or with their policing issues in the face of a state house that is a little less than receptive. It's incredibly complicated. State procedures govern all sorts of redistribution issues. And as you can see in the 4 states I've mentioned, just these happen to be 4 states in which Kresge works deeply. There's just a multiplication of friction points, right? And if you go up to that little red box at the top level, you realize that all of those challenges that the federal government has about being understaffed, being sort of caught in sort of unrealistic time constraints, on and on and on, apply in spades in the layer of the state policies. And ultimately, the biggest challenge is how do you divide these monies up? How do you determine your priorities? How do you make sure they're equitable? How do you make sure they're effective? That sort of thing. But then the real complexity goes into the very bottom tier, which is when these monies hit the ground. Because all of a sudden, you've got all of the complexity that sort of has been gathering, all of the friction that has been gathering at the federal and state levels dropping into community. And they're everything from procurement requirements, bonding requirements, insufficient capacity on the part of local nonprofits to gear up and absorb and distribute monies. I mean, it's just on and on and on. And so I don't mean to belabor the point that the complexity of the drawing is just really meant to be a shorthand for any number of different ways in which this whole process is complex. And it does sort of frame the question in my mind of, into this complexity, does philanthropy really have any business poking its nose? And I think my answer is yes, it does. And so let me try, if I can, Kathy, yay, to suggest what Joel has seen before, which is 6 roles that philanthropy, particularly in Detroit, has played. This is a little bit Kresge-centric, but I think it applies to philanthropy writ large. My thesis is that in various combinations, philanthropy can do 5 or 6 things. It can shapeshift, it can combine, but these are 5 distinct roles that philanthropy can play. And what I'd like to do very briefly is sort of walk through each and talk about one application to the sort of federal capital flow environment. So first one, just very briefly, is table setting, the ability just to sort of have hard conversations that sometimes the public and the private sector can't have. Second is to help build community capacity to implement stuff, whether that's federal capital stuff or it's day-to-day community stuff, whether those are CDFIs or community-based development organizations or some of the nonprofits we've heard from around the room. Third is to peel away risk, to try to signal to the private sector that there is actually an investable proposition in what the private sector often can't see, and to begin sort of a flywheel turning that permits markets to behave a little bit differently. The fourth, this is a sort of a strange term, but to serve as a guarantor of value, to actually invest in public goods that, again, signal both to the public and to the private sectors that there is stability and long-term investability in a community, and we'll talk more about that. Fifth is sort of acting as a Sherpa, actually helping people from the outside of a community understand the ground truth in a community. And I think locally based philanthropy is particularly good at that. We saw that so powerfully before, during, and after the bankruptcy in Detroit, where it was such a mess in Detroit that people really needed people to ground truth, whether you could move money here or you could move talent here, you could move attention there. And it became, I think, a really important role. And sixth and finally is just serving as a steward of ecologies like human services, like early childhood, like arts and culture that are often marginalized or almost ignored by the public and the private sector. So I'll scroll through each of these in turn, and I'll do it quickly. So the first is table setting. It's just trying to understand that decision-making at a community level is a really complex proposition with a very long horizon line, that you really do need to understand the value of sort of an iterative, engaged community process that is often messy and often very threatening to public officials. This is, in Detroit, we see this time and time again, whether it's over land use or the creation of transit policy or whatever. There are just conversations and tables that it's very hard for the public sector to assemble. And so the example I'd like to use here is early childhood. 5 or 6 years ago, it was becoming painfully clear that the city of Detroit just had absolutely no comprehensive, integrative, intentional set of systems having to do with early childhood development. Lots of good people providing service in all sorts of ways, but no support for infrastructure upgrades, no support for training, inadequate wages, poor public policy, you can imagine. Actually, North Carolina, I think, is way ahead of the curve on most places on this, but in Detroit, it was really a mess. And so one of the things that Kellogg and Kresge decided is that we would try to create a community-based process that would ultimately lead to a frame that would help steer investment. And to make a very long story short, if you sort of follow the left side of the page, you can see that we formed a community stewardship board. We opened up a community engagement process. We had parents and providers and kids themselves engaged, not so much the early childhood kids, but the other kids in the system engaged. And we ultimately created the framework that's represented on the right-hand side of the drawing. And it ended up being an extraordinarily effective effort. Not only did Kresge and Kellogg agree to put in $50 million to kind of get this jump-started, and it has, but it drew other investors into the space. And the reason I use it as an example here is that when the state of Michigan got its ARPA allocations, this in many ways was its primary priority. Governor Whitmer has actually created a whole new lane of support for early childhood development. I don't know that we caused that, but we sure helped. And the fact that these monies could drop into the state's largest city effectively, be absorbed, be deployed in ways that made complete sense, I think was really powerful to the governor. And even if we didn't influence her decision, the fact that this system was in place means that these monies that she has dedicated in her new budget will be absorbed effectively and pushed out effectively and make just a huge difference in the life of kids in Detroit. The second very quick example is very different, which is 5 or 6 years ago, the Knight Foundation, the William Penn Foundation in Philadelphia, and Kresge got together to try to figure out ways that we could elevate what we called the civic commons. Those public spaces that we talked about earlier that have huge centrality to a community's daily life, but that are often underinvested and often, again, marginalized. And what we saw was that the city of Philadelphia was doing really path-breaking work in trying to figure out how its libraries, its open spaces, its other public spaces could be joined into a more integrative system that was much more democratically accessible to community members. And they were really doing extraordinary work. And we thought, well, maybe that work could be done in other places. And so we essentially did a request for ideas, and we got back Detroit and Chicago and Memphis and Akron. In each of those places, the work has been going on for the last number of years and has sort of gelled into really powerful work. I mention it because the Akron work had to do with the sort of the reimagination of the Erie and Ohio Canal, and it connects to a lake, and the lake connects to the downtown. I mean, it really becomes the sort of the armature of a very different kind of civic life in Akron. And they have done all sorts of planning and groundwork, and it was just a project waiting to happen. And sure enough, the first $8.5 million of ARPA funding coming into the city went to this project. So again, this table setting concept of sort of getting investments ready for these kinds of moments. No one could have seen these federal dollars coming in the door, but we could create a machinery that would activate under the proper circumstance. And that's exactly what happened with the early childhood machinery and with the reimagining the civic commons machinery. So the second role is building community capacity. And I think this really speaks for itself. When you think about all these dollars moving to ground, the city hall and county government can be the steward of priority setting, and they are. They should be. They hold the election certificate, and that's where the decision-making ultimately should land. But think about, how does that money move to ground? How do you build nonprofit housing? How do you upgrade an early childhood center? How do you do housing demolition? It is through sort of a second and a third layer of community capacity that needs to be fortified. And so we've spent a lot of time in Detroit, pre-bankruptcy, during bankruptcy, after bankruptcy, investing in things like the community development finance infrastructure, the nonprofit infrastructure, community development organizations, and on and on. And there's probably nothing more important to do with these federal dollars than to think about what kind of community finance infrastructure do communities need in order to effectively sort of turn those monies into these different channels. And this drawing is an attempt to suggest that we need different channels of community-based finance, that banks just, with all of the big announcements and all of the good intentions, they just can't move money to ground. I mean, their regulatory structures, their shareholder restrictions, all sorts of things make it very difficult. And so what we're seeing is across the country is the emergence of three very different bodies of work. One is there's a very intense interest in trying to figure out how community ownership of assets can sort of morph into its next generation. We know land trusts, we know all sorts of ways of sort of holding property and community, but the idea that we could try to begin figuring out new machinery to have community hold assets that could appreciate in value so that either the community owns them over the long term, or if there does need to be a transfer of ownership, they reap the benefits. It's a simple concept, but it's enormously powerful. And what we're seeing in a number of communities across the country, Oakland, Detroit, and others, is some really innovative financing mechanisms. But it requires moving capital differently. And we've been working with Deloitte and a number of other national firms to try to figure out what's the scale at which national investors can engage. How do you have national investors engage while preserving the integrity of local ownership? I mean, it's just really complicated stuff. Second is just, this is a moment for community development finance institutions that a lot of money is going to move into CDFIs, and we just have to figure out a way to buttress that. Again, I think what we're seeing is a lot of good intention signaling, but the actual movement of dollars into CDFIs has been really slow, really sluggish. All sorts of reasons for that, but there are all sorts of different ways that you can open up the aperture of that process and move money into those institutions. And the third is that we just need some new creative ways of moving capital on the ground. I mean, I was reading something the other day about black-owned banks. We have 14,000 banks in the United States. 20 are black-owned. Think about that. There are all sorts of reasons for that. I don't need to tell you all. Some of them are remedial, some of them aren't. But the point is, in order to break that lock, we've just got to figure out a different way to move capital down to community in a way that permits, whether it's a bank or a restaurant or a jazz club, to benefit from that capital moving. And it just seems to me that this is the moment to do it when you have all of this federal money moving. And here, let me just give you a quick example. A couple of years ago, Raquel Hatter, who someone mentioned earlier, our head of human services, made a very small grant to a group of human service organizations and very thinly capitalized CDFIs in Hawaii, of all places. Hawaii is a complicated place. It has every bit the same challenges that other cities and communities in America have, and they just were having a lot of trouble gathering capital. And we couldn't figure out why they weren't drawing down their sort of fair share of CDFI money. And so we paid another visit, and our social investment team went out and basically realized that they just needed sort of a little bit of a push to build their capacity. So we made a small $200,000 grant, asked local community foundations to sort of come up with the balance so that they could have $1 million to spend a year or two sort of retooling, getting their back office work coordinated, and a number of other things. And they set as a goal raising $5 million for the National CDFI, getting their back office work coordinated, and a number of other things. And they set as a goal raising $5 million for the National CDFI Fund within 3 years. Within 1 year, they raised that $5 million. It wasn't much. It was just investing in basic operations, basic operating support for these nonprofits. They're now working as a group. They're investing new capital. And it just seems to me that they really are poised to sort of take advantage of this new CDFI moment that I described. There we go. The third, and I'll start moving a little bit more quickly here. The third function is that the notion I talked about earlier of peeling away the first layer of risk and trying to essentially act as social venture capital, trying to demonstrate to the private markets that you can get the flywheel of economic development going. And Kresge has done a lot of that over the last many years in Detroit. And the question is, again, is there sort of a place to do that in the new environment? And here I wanted to use an example that is a little bit of a throwback, but it's, I think, illustrative. And this is the payroll protection program that came out of the CARES Act. Essentially, the Small Business Administration sort of freed up these funds, as I think you all remember, to try to provide ballast to small organizations in community, restaurants, small business owners, and the like. And in their first round of releasing money, they released it to banks, including community banks. But what happened was that because those were depository institutions, those banks moved the money to the people with whom they had relationships. Just makes sense. Or with whom they might like to have relationships. And so they hit the big cultural organizations, they hit the big nonprofits, but they, as you can see with this little wall that gets hit, they did not hit the small 1, 2, 3, 4 person operation at the community level. So Kresge, a bunch of other stuff, sort of rang the bell at Treasury and SBA and said, you know, this just, it's the right idea, it's the wrong delivery mechanism. And so the SBA was willing to essentially go back, rethink, and opened up distribution to non-depository financial institutions like CDFIs. And so we chose one and asked if they would work in Detroit and Memphis, New Orleans, and Fresno, 4 cities in which we work. And we parked a bunch of liquidity with them and a grant to help them retool. It's called the Community Reinvestment Fund. They're out of Minneapolis. They're very good. And they were able to take the money and then move it to ground. And again, the numbers are small in this particular case, but 40 businesses received SBA money that would not have received it in the first round. And we were able to move about $8 million into those into those restaurants and small business places. And I just think it's another good example of how you can sort of use philanthropy to sort of peel risk away and permit by creating a series of protections for something like a CDFI, the ability to move these monies to ground. The fourth role is this guarantor of value concept. And here, this is essentially investing in essential infrastructure and essential public space, like a riverfront, like a light rail line in Detroit's case, any number of instances you might imagine that, again, help the private sector understand that there is stability and health in community in a way that will permit them to invest over the long term. And the example here is something called the Joe Louis Greenway in Detroit. This is a 28-mile trail that essentially tries to connect the northeasternmost extension of the Detroit Riverwalk down along the river to the southwestern edge and then circle around and create essentially a loop. It's sort of like the Beltline in Atlanta or the 29th Street Greenway in Minneapolis. The idea is that this becomes an economic development driver. The problem is Well, the good news is that this was a project just waiting for federal dollars, and federal dollars it got. It got both state and local allocations, almost $100 million. And that's just about enough to pour concrete for 28 miles. And so if that's where you stop, what you've done is a paving project. What you need to do is create a community development tool, because this greenway, without any kind of work along its edges or in its interior, will just remain concrete. And so what we have done at Kresge, along with a number of philanthropic partners, is to say, are there hubs along the greenway in which we could invest in building out the sort of the full spectrum of supports that a community needs in order to be successful, and which would give people a reason to go on the greenway. And once they got into the greenway, maybe, heaven forbid, they would actually go into the neighborhoods and go into the businesses and into the other attractions of a place. And you can see here the 4 or 5 that we've identified. I want to just take a very quick look at the one in blue, which is up in northwest Detroit. It's called the Livernois 6 Mile area. And this is just, I think, illustrative of what we're going to try to do going forward. This happens to be an area in which Kresge has worked for many years, and so this is a little bit more built out than the other hubs, but I think the blueprint is essentially the same. Because what you have here is essentially the beginnings of a complete neighborhood. And that seems so obvious to folks outside of Detroit, but in Detroit, this is a big deal. Creating an educational anchor, creating a small business corridor that is vital and sustainable, creating open space that can actually connect institutions within the area, creating a housing stabilization, rehab plan, and creating a backbone organization, a community development organization that actually can hold the work and push the work forward, are all things that we've done in Live 6. And I think it just becomes really clear to us that as the city admirably creates this Joe Louis Greenway, the rest of the civic community needs to really lean into the build out of the nodes on its shoulder and in its interior. And I think this is just one example of how that might be done. The fifth role is this acting as a Sherpa role, trying to make sense for people who want to invest in a place how that might best be done. And this sort of brings me full circle to where we began, because after it became clear that these federal dollars were going to begin to flow in the kind of magnitude that we've talked about, something really interesting happened. It was almost like kudzu. I mean, all of these organizations sprouted up to try to make sure that philanthropy was connected to the federal government. I mean, I got a call from Congressman Richmond. I mean, I got all these folks were just really interested in how can all of these federal dollars do what we've been talking about for the last time. How do they move through these different layers? How do they hit ground? How do they reinforce the aspirations that we articulated at the beginning? And so just one after another sort of popped up. And this is what happened. Again, this is one of those drawings where I won't ask you to repeat back what you see. But let me just say, this very personal map, I've got, 10 or 11 of these yellow boxes which represent these intermediating organizations trying to be helpful and being helpful. But you could double that. Yeah, there are a lot of them. But what I'd love to have you just focus on for the moment is that they could be organized around topic. You've got some focused on the environment, some focused on transit, some focused on housing, some focused on small business. You could similarly focus on what the money, what you're trying to have the money do. Would it be project planning? Would it be just more effective grant application? Would it be helping the federal government get itself organized? We've had a lot of those requests. But what ultimately is interesting is how the philanthropic community and its partners here have sort of sorted. And that's the little blue box down on the lower left. Because you have a whole group of these that are sort of air traffic control, saying you're already investing in the environment, therefore we need an intermediating organization to make sure that's all coherent and coordinated. Okay, good idea. You've got a bunch of these that are focused on pooling funds, saying we need a big pot of money to make sure that we can build the capacity in this particular space, or that we can supplement the matching requirements that the feds have for this kind of project or that kind of project. One of the most interesting examples of that is something that the Hewlett Foundation is now trying to put together, which is a very large multi-funder pool to try to figure out how to advance the Infrastructure Reduction Act's provisions for climate. You've got funder hubs, which are essentially trying to figure out how the pooled expertise of philanthropy can be applied to something. You know, all of the environmental funders, or all of the housing funders, or all the small business funders, and using a third party to help corral that expertise and move it to ground. And you've got technical assistance hubs, which are essentially, let's provide municipalities, counties, states with the kind of technical assistance they need in order to crack the code of federal dollar flows. Probably the best example of that is Bloomberg Philanthropy's extraordinary. Bloomberg is extraordinary. It's a whole other conversation. But they have put together a $50 million fund with Bloomberg, Kresge, the Emerson Collaborative, Ford Foundation, to try to help municipalities just simply identify what funding opportunities there are and get ready to draw them down. And when you think about it, if you're a small rural community, that's a hard thing. Making sense of those blue boxes that we talked about before, and all that crazy, all those faucets and pipes and everything, it's a really good investment. And so I give Bloomberg a lot of credit. So this is, I think, sort of an affirmation that there probably is a role to play for philanthropy. And there's all of this different energy around trying to figure out what it might be. I don't think all of these things will ultimately necessarily be tremendously helpful, but some might. And for everyone that is, that's just a benefit. And so finally, and then I'll stop here, the sixth role is simply trying to help make society's sort of soft tissue work effective. Arts and culture, human services, the things that markets really haven't traditionally valued. And here, I just wanted to use a quick illustration, which is the simple notion that hard infrastructure and human infrastructure essentially are inextricably interlinked. You cannot separate the one. So on the right side in the green, you have sort of the soft tissue stuff: public health, workforce development, arts and culture. On the left side, you have the hard-wired stuff: housing, transit, roads, et cetera, et cetera. And in the middle, what I've done is show you Detroit's ARPA allocation, which involves both. It involves both the red and the green, right? You can't separate these two things. And what the challenge is, I think, is making sure that the right side of this equation doesn't get shortchanged, particularly in the Infrastructure Act, because there it's going to be very easy, desirable to be sure, to rebuild ridges, rebuild roads, lay pipe, but there are things that come with that in terms of workforce development, community equity, just tons of complexity that only the sort of the soft tissue issues help you get at. And here, let me just close with the simple example of arts and culture. This is just a depiction, it just seems to me, of how arts and culture in Detroit sort of works, but in many ways, it suggests the various ways in which
left-hand purple box. I can't imagine how we would have gotten through COVID without arts and cultural activity. Whether individual artists, arts organizations, community-based arts organizing, it has a rare ability to raise tough issues, to suggest innovative problems, and to move people to places of identity and pride in ways that just everything else we do doesn't. It's almost like society's dark matter, right? It's sort of invisible, but it helps hold our community together. And one of the things that I think will be most important, particularly as we move into the hardwired part of the equation, the infrastructure bill, is seeing arts and culture as an essential tool in helping do community development in much more creative ways. And I think I'm probably speaking out of turn, forgive me, but the National Endowment of the Arts, as we speak, is trying to figure out how to do a large national conversation with the federal departments about how that can happen. How can arts and culture help when you're building a new road? How can it help when you're undertaking a new housing project? Whatever it is. We don't have to invent this. We have example after example after example over scores and scores and scores of years about how arts and culture can help open up again the aperture of community problem solving. And so I think there are lots of ways in which this can be helpful, and that's only one. So with that, I've gone too long, but I think it just is what I really hope you take away from all these goofy drawings is that this is really hard. It is really momentous. We cannot afford to lose this moment. And for those of you who care about philanthropy or work in philanthropy, now is not the time to go back to your corner. I mean, this is a time, it seems to me, that philanthropy can lean in, whether it's these 6 roles or any number of others you might imagine. I just think it's a really important time for us all to get into the mix. So, sorry to go quite so long, but that's all I have to say.
You didn't go too long. You were exactly what we estimated, usually ending at, sorry. Oh, I said, you didn't go too long because we intended to stop the formal discussion at 5:30.
Oh, good.
And you actually got 3 minutes early. Would you have anything?
Yeah. I have 6 more roles I'd like to talk about.
In any event, the floor is now open for comments, questions, and anything anybody wants to add to the discussion. Sure.
We need to move the mic, huh?
Yep. May I use this one? Thank you. Thank you.
I mentioned seeing you. We had our national meeting in Detroit a couple of years ago, and I fell in love with the town. Thank you very much. It's really an incredible place. It's just alive. You mentioned guaranteeing debt, I guess, being the guarantor. What are the pluses and minuses of that, and why don't more foundations consider it?
What a great question. For those of you who may not understand the underpinnings of that, foundations can use their balance sheet without spending a dime. We can guarantee the repayment of debt, and very, very few foundations do it. We have come through a brilliant social investment team led by a guy named Aaron Seibert to do a lot of that. And what we are finding is that it's an enormously effective tool that rarely gets called. I mean, I assume that at some point one of these debts will go bad and we will have to step in and guarantee its results. But think about if you were to guarantee $100 million of projects, debt, and let's say 10% of those failed, you would have lost $10 million. But if you had invested $10 million in a grant, you wouldn't have gotten $100 million a project, right? And so years ago, we actually set up something called a guarantee bank, in which we invited other foundations to join with us to create a guarantee pool that would then be dedicated to the environment, to housing, and to small business. And we were able to get, I think it's about 20 other foundations to do that. The pool is not huge, but we set up an intermediary to help implement it. It moves through CDFIs, and it's been pretty effective. But I must admit, it has been hard for us to understand why more foundations don't do this. It's a way to, I mean, because otherwise we're sitting on our balance sheet, and that's been a critique of philanthropy, right? So you have these huge, you're a $3 billion foundation, you spend 5% of it each year. What about the rest? And this is just one of those ways to use the rest without necessarily jeopardizing your perpetuity.
For financing affordable housing, because there's a revenue source, you could issue tax-exempt revenue bonds,
And with your enhancement, you get a AAA rating.
Absolutely.
The rent by $200 or $300
Yep, we're looking at exactly something like that in Detroit now.
David.
Sorry, Kathy. Sorry, Congressman, just a minute.
She likes the exercise.
I do. Getting all my steps in.
Just trying to discern here as you talk exactly whom you're working with or what organizational level you're interjecting yourselves. And I just wonder, what about the nonprofit sector and the role that they have in drawing down so much federal funding, and the capacity that they need that you presumably could contribute to. I'll give you a quick example. We over these last years have brought back. I've been very eager to bring back the Section 202 Housing for the Elderly program, where it was basically frozen in place for a decade. But it has been we've kind of lost the muscle memory. A lot of the congregations that had formed the 501c3s, a lot of the nonprofits that had applied for that funding, they weren't just good to go once the money became available. In fact, it's pretty spotty around the country how many people are accessing those funds. Same would apply for housing for people with disabilities, and for other housing for people with AIDS. These programs they're not formula programs. It's not manna from heaven. You're going to have to go after it, and you're going to have some capacity to do that. And it strikes me that there's a lot of variability in that capability, and that foundations could make a big difference there in just across the board in kind of activating these groups, empowering these groups, helping these groups gain the capacity to go after these funds, because so much of it is at that level.
I couldn't agree more. And I probably should have spent more time with lots more illustrations on that second role of building capacity, because I think you're absolutely right. I mean, think of how overwhelming it is for a nonprofit, whether it's for a senior living project or a people with disabilities project, understanding what the rules are, understanding how to access them, how to get the application in is hard enough. Then you get the money, you have to have the muscle memory to be able to move it to ground. So this absorption and distribution capacity is huge. And if there is anything that foundations ought to be able to do, it's that. These are the folks we work with every day. We have currently 400 or 500 grantees. Everyone is a nonprofit. So, shame on us if we cannot figure out a way to make sure that these folks in communities across the country are ready. And in fairness, I think this is what philanthropy tends to be good at, particularly, I'll get in trouble, particularly community-based philanthropy. I just think that this period is a sweet spot for local community-based philanthropy, whether it's Babcock Reynolds, whether it's Kresge, whether it's a community foundation. I mean, these are places that know their community. They know where the shortfalls of capacity are. They know where they might be able to absorb additional philanthropic dollars and use, or a loaned executive or whatever it is. So I couldn't agree more. I think you're absolutely right.
As you think you talked about this, I was mindful. Yeah, thank you. As you were talking about this, I was mindful of the example. The same problem existed with respect to money for kids, for food for kids, right? The feds put up a lot of money, state by state, and the kids didn't sign up. And so you ended up having the organization that Billy Shore started, called End Kid Hunger, that organized them state by state and went out. There are now, I would say, 40 state committees that are focused, targeted on getting those kids who had money available that the states never drew down, getting them signed up for the effort. It's not the same problem, because in that particular case it was individuals, but the problem was generically the same, in the sense that programs that were there, but people had to do something to take advantage of them. They need instruction in getting it done. And so, it's probably better for foundations to devote their time in organizing states to do the same thing than it is to try to figure out how individual foundations that are scattered all over the country do them. I don't know. I just simply say that the analogy seems to me to be accurate, but it's all a question of educating people to opportunities that are there that they don't know how to take advantage of. or don't, they surely have the incentive to do it, but they don't know how to do it. Now, other people, yeah, there you go. There you go.
Great. Rip, I had a question for you based on actually an amazing experience that we in Durham here had with the Kresge Foundation and your team. Really amazing positive from the perspective of so many institutions do a lot of virtue signaling as it relates to equity. And the Kresge Foundation has been a leader in operationalizing equity and using it as a tool to shift power. And we saw amazing leaders on your team. So Stacy, Chantel, Anna, Sidra, stand with Cameron and communities and partnerships. So a national foundation standing with a Black woman-led, Black woman-founded organization here in Durham, a hyper-local organization being supported in every way, shape, and form by a national foundation. I was curious just how you set the tone within the organization as it related to that and how you were supporting your team around that.
Oh, I thought you were going in a different direction. That's a much harder question. I thought you were going to ask how do we choose where to work, because it's that kind of intense focus on people and place is really important to us, that we not just go through the motions. So yours is a harder question. There are probably some people watching who could answer that better than I, but I think ultimately building an organization that reflects the people it seeks to serve is really important. And so when I came, we had about 20 people. We now have about 120, and it's a staff that is diverse not only by race and ethnicity, but by experience, by professional background, by temperament. And I think what we've tried to do is simply say that just as we've worked in Detroit in a way that sort of respects sort of the local circumstance and context and people who have been working there for hundreds of years, so too when we enter any community, should that be the case. Because we may be a Sherpa in Detroit, sort of, but we're not a Sherpa in Durham. And so to be able to rely on the kind of leadership that you provide is critical. But if you don't have the kind of employees, staff, who are comfortable with working that way, then it doesn't work. So I think in some ways it's all about your talent. It's, talent is probably the wrong word, but it's about the personal qualities of the people you hire. And I'd love to take more credit for that, but all of the names you listed are just sort of extraordinary, whether I'm in the mix or not. So I don't know what I contribute to that mix, but I think you can set a tone at the top that it's about people, it's about change, it's about constructive engagement, it's about respect for people doing the work. It's kind of that simple.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you for presenting a tremendous amount of information, a large number of initiatives. It's overwhelming.
Yeah, sorry.
And you've organized it into 6 roles that philanthropy can play to have an impact. And as you presented, I wondered, to what extent is the organization into 6 roles top-down, theory-driven, a priori, logic model-based, this is how philanthropy can have an impact, versus bottom-up, stakeholder-based, community, thousand flowers blooming, maybe even after the fact, categorization of what you do into these 6 roles. And the implication is then going into a new community, would you come in a priori with these are the 6 roles that philanthropy can play to have the strongest impact, or would you have a different set of roles for a different community?
These questions are too hard, Joel.
It's sure not a priority. It just can't be, right? But having said that, one of the reasons I used these rules today, because I 2 months ago I had no idea what I was going to say to you all. I just thought we probably should talk about federal dollars and what do I say about that? And I thought, well, descriptively, if I look back, how did we position ourselves before the bankruptcy when the private sector was in free fall, the public sector was in the penitentiary, and the civic sector was just sort of hanging on by a thread? We did variations on this. There was some table setting we had to do because we had to figure out how to talk about blight, and no one was willing to talk about blight and land use. We had to figure out how to build capacity because we didn't have a single CDFI in the city of Detroit. We had to talk about de-risking transactions because the private sector wouldn't get near our major thoroughfares and invest, on and on and on. So at some level, it was sort of looking back and descriptive about what had sort of surfaced transactionally, right? We knew we had to do community-based finance. We knew we had to do capacity building, but it wasn't that I've got 6 roles in my head and therefore we're going to drive our work through it. But then something strange happened because during the bankruptcy and immediately after the bankruptcy, I came and I laid out these same 6 roles and as a sort of a test. Do they apply to what we've done? It's not, again, did we drive everything through them, but are they sufficiently adaptable? And can you sort of shape-shift them to sort of apply to different sort of sets of problems? And I think the answer was yes. And so I think the real answer is that they're largely descriptive, but they're helpful, I think. They're helpful to sort of push ourselves to say, is there a circumstance in Durham in which one of these roles might be helpful? If not, let's do something different. But turns out probably there is, right? These are pretty general roles. So the idea that we have sort of some guidance, some sort of sense of what we can do well and what we can't do well. But I think in fairness, it's more retrospective than it is prospective.
Yes, so this question comes from Ryan Comfort. They said, this question is related to the Sherpa for More Resources role. As more and more ultra-high net worth givers start donating billions of dollars, what role do you think existing players in philanthropy, like Kresge, will play to increase the amount and the effectiveness of their giving?
That's a profoundly important question. And I was actually thinking about, all right, what does McKinsey Scott have to do with all of this? These sort of money bombs. And I think what they become is venture capital for mature organizations. I mean, again, there's a little bit of the sort of the big, huge investments that is flowing to small, Black-led, women-led, community-based organizations. Some, but it's mostly going to WISE and to, really important parts of the civic infrastructure. And so I tend to think, and I think McKinsey Scott is in her own category. We have other people trying to give big gifts, and that's always been the case. But I think what she has done is sort of created another subsystem of a philanthropic ecology. I mean, it's sort of created something new, right? And so I think that in some ways what will be interesting is whether her patterns of giving change over time. Because essentially what she's done is found a really competent third-party person whom Joel knows to essentially be program officer. To whom should I give these money bombs? And that's really important. But over time, as you go into the 4th and 5th and 6th wave of those money bombs, I think her method is going to change a little bit because she will have covered the capitalization needs of a lot of the midsection of the nonprofit community. And I'm not sure that's quite yet dropped down. And at that point, when it begins to drop down into sort of smaller, more localized community change work, as opposed to sort of social service work, then I think the Sherpa role becomes important again. I think then you need the Raleigh Community Foundation to say,
we can help you. If you're interested in trying to find out the most effective 3 organizations in Raleigh serving low-income people trying to gain shelter, here would be our recommendation. So I think it's going to come. I think it's nothing but good. I mean, she's amazing. I think what she has done is stunning. But I do think it's going to change, or I think it will change. I think it should change as she gives the rest of her $50 billion away.
Over here. Thanks again so much for all of this. Excuse me. John Killeen.
If you know you want to talk, hold up your hand, and the others, Cass will bring it over after you.
All right. I guess I want to do 2 things really briefly. One is say thank you for raising the role philanthropy can play in convening discussions about third rail topics locally. I think that's sort of alluded to a little bit in the case of your support with CIP, Communities in Partnership in Durham too, right? The ability to address topics that are usually sort of suppressed by local conservatism and fear of institutions. And it should disarm a lot of that conservatism, I think, too, when that happens. I think there's a lot of profound opportunity there. So I'd like to hear that. Second is really just a question about something that's not really named in the roles that you've described so far, which is given all of the machinery that you've drawn and described for us, all of the pieces, those components, the stakeholder institutions, agencies, are really hardwired to produce disparate impacts across race and class and gender and so on. And that's just how that is, right? We know that. What role is there then, should we expect for philanthropy, or can philanthropy advance in also verifying whether all of these interventions and other roles you've described really do produce a change of course for us and lead to greater power, autonomy, wealth, well-being, safety, et cetera, for Black and Indigenous and people of color and their communities in America?
That's a great example. In Detroit, we set up a number of years ago something called the Detroit Future City Office. This originally was intended to be the steward of a very comprehensive community-based land use plan that we developed right around the time of the bankruptcy. And we encouraged Detroit Future City to ask exactly this question. You know, with all of the attention that both at the municipal level, the state level, and the federal level that is going into Detroit, is it making the kind of difference that results in sort of more equitable outcomes? And so Detroit Future City has begun a series of really provocative sort of examinations of how the money moves, to whom does it benefit, are we just entrenching the kinds of frictions and sort of poor outcomes that you've described, or is it helping to move the needle? Is it moving more Black folks into the middle class? Is it creating different systems? Is it how are community organizations beginning to behave differently, and how are they being treated different? You know, the whole spectrum. It is. I actually think if there were some way to house something like that in every community outside of City Hall, it would be really important. When we first stood up Detroit Future City, Mayor Duggan desperately wanted it in City Hall. And he's a terrific mayor, and he's done wonderful things for the city of Detroit. But this is one of those functions that needs to sit outside of City Hall. It needs to move beyond a particular administration. It needs to have objective distance. It needs to have safe space. And frankly, philanthropy has got to have its back, right? And so I think this is, if I were to give advice, and I'm loath to do that, to a community foundation, I would say do this. You know, try to figure out whether you have that already existing in your community, or whether you need to stand something up or fortify something. Make sure that somehow someone is asking these questions. It's very difficult. I mean, as you all can imagine, academically, analytically, taking this stuff apart and putting it back together to figure out what really works and what doesn't and what the effects are is really hard. Attribution is almost impossible. But I think you can track over time the trajectory so that you can basically say, you know, this housing rehab program is just not doing what we thought it was going to do. Or our Live 6 program that I talked about, where we're trying to build out this sort of the comprehensive community in Northwest Detroit. Someone needs to hold our feet to the fire. Really? You know, or are you just, you know, moving a bunch of affluent suburban white folks into the community to take advantage of all of these wonderful qualities of life. It may be, and we need to know that. So, but it's really, you're right, it's really hard. Is that responsive, kind of? Yeah, kind of.
Another question on the chat.
Oh.
So this is from Scott Bernstein. He says, great presentation.
No fair.
Many provisions of the Infrastructure Bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the CHIPS Act are about removing barriers, and the available funds look small. But the effects are essential to housing affordability, pace of redevelopment, poverty reduction, climate protection. Isn't investing in enabling actions a role for philanthropy too?
For those of you who don't know, Scott, I don't know, did you found or have you just run for 100 years the Center for Community Change? It's one of the most remarkable urban thinkers in America, so I'm not going to even answer that question.
It doesn't feel a day over 100, right?
So the question, Scott, is what? The question is how should we be investing in enabling conditions, enabling policy conditions?
Yeah, the one that Bob Chapman raised earlier. I mean, HUD's committed all of a sudden to helping cities actually change their own zoning rules. EPA's doing a critical review of their own barriers and regulations. FEMA's finally looking at how their own benefit cost analysis may be preventing the very people they're trying to help from accessing the BRIC funds. And so they don't bring big money along, but you can't get the money at all unless you do something about those things. And isn't that a role for philanthropy too, as opposed to seeing if just pushing harder will bring the money home faster?
Yep, you're absolutely right. And that crazy drawing with all of those intermediating organizations, Scott, I think you'll find a number of those are trying to do exactly that. I mean, you've got Harriet Tregoning trying to stand up a whole different way of thinking about transit policy, and it pushes on exactly the kinds of buttons you've talked about. I think Larry Kramer at Hewlett is going to try to do that with the Infrastructure Reduction Act monies. I mean, so absolutely, and one of the reasons I put all those 10 boxes on that drawing is Kresge's invested in all 10 of them. Probably not wise, but it is absolutely important to cover those bases. I think I couldn't agree more.
Thank you.
Good evening, Mr. Rapson. Thank you so much for this system drawings. I think they really show the feedback loops from problem to problem. So I have two questions. I mean, probably they are a little unrelated. One is, if I may boil down tying the government apparatus to community service delivery. I think if that last mile delivery is the problem, how do you pick up those bright spots and scale them across different communities you work, if there are some learnings there? Second question was regarding managing risk. How do you distinguish if there is a framework in your mind like AIM or XPSR of impact financing, and if you envision a Kresge bank where there is social impact financing, how do you really de-risk and communicate that to both stakeholders, one community to the investors, to inspire more philanthropies to participate in your bank?
I'm going to come back on the second question in just a moment. I'm not sure I understand, but the first one, I've come to, and this is probably not going to be popular, I've come to really dislike the term scale. I think it's translation. I mean, if we can do something in Memphis, it doesn't scale to New Orleans. It translates to New Orleans, maybe, if we're lucky. And I think that process of translation becomes a little bit the earlier question, is how do you think about the context? How do you think about the roles that different parties play? Because it may be not that it's not philanthropy that's playing all these roles, right? It may be a community it may be a community chest. It may be a particularly effective nonprofit. It may be the mayor's office. It may be lots of things. So I think, I think trying to identify these promising practices is important. And one of the functions that I think I skipped over in terms of these intermediating institutions is a bunch of them are just simply trying to exchange best practices. So the National Conference of Mayors, for example, is just compiling really thoughtful examples of what people are doing on the ground. And so hopefully, that gets picked up. But then it's hard to know how to move thing from a good thing from one place to another, right? So I think it falls to places like Kresge that work in different places to try to say, well, what does it look like in Durham? Is that quite different from what it looks like in Fresno? If so, would there be any value in having the people from Fresno talk to the people from Durham? Maybe, maybe not. So I think that's always been an Achilles heel of philanthropy, is thinking that you can scale stuff. If you get the model right, you scale it. Maybe if you get the model right, you can attract deeper investment, a la the Hawaii example. Maybe if you get the model right, you can get the attention of somewhere else. We've done that a lot in our work in Detroit. I think a lot of people have picked up some of the things that we've done. But ultimately, the political context, the historical context, the capacity context is so different from place to place. So I'm not sure I quite understood the risk question. Is how do we say again? I'm sorry.
My bad, Mr. Rapson. I had the privilege of working with World Bank, who was investing in impact financing, and the biggest challenge they had was any framework they came up with of de-risking and communicating non-performing assets or stuff like that. They really had difficulty convincing investors to say this is worth investing in for the impact you'll get. So I was wondering, is that the challenge you were facing with the Kresge Bank, where you wanted to inspire more investors?
I see. Yeah, that's exactly it. So for example, our major corridor in Detroit is the Woodward Avenue corridor. Light rail line runs right up the middle. It's sort of the heart of the city. And you could not get the private sector to invest in it. It was the craziest thing, but they were looking at real numbers, real hard algorithms that didn't pencil out for them. And so we needed to sort of step in with discretionary, flexible, philanthropic capital. And someone said, well, you're going to be doing that forever, right? If it's not investable, it's not investable. Well, what happens if it is investable and it's just not apparent? And so what happened was that we began making these investments, revolving loan funds for commercial, for housing, for others. And it turns out that the flywheel actually did start to turn, and the market started to turn, and the cost return ratios began to converge and flip. And all of a sudden, the private sector found that this was actually an investable proposition. So, and maybe that's a good example of scaling within a place. We were able to get enough proof points to be able to demonstrate to the private investors that you actually could do it. You could actually get a return. And it's along that corridor, we've probably seen close to $12 billion of investment in the last decade, which for Detroit is a big number.
Last question.
So earlier you were talking about venture capital for mature organizations, which I think is interesting when we think about, what are these jobs that philanthropy has to understand really clearly in the world. And I'm curious about your take on the job of philanthropy's role for immature organizations and whose job in philanthropy that is, right? I think there's probably consensus that it's somebody's job. It's a check in the box of these, somewhere in these 6, right, in the matrix. I'm not sure which page it's on, but it's somewhere in there, right? And if that's the job of a community foundation, if that's the job of, donor advised funds or more flexible capital, or if actually it's a little bit blurry, it's the job of what you were talking about, social finance or, social impact bonds, or these sort of newer flexible types of capital that sometimes feel like a little bit like, oh, the private sector said they were going to do it, philanthropy said they were going to do it, we're a little bit of like a he said, she said. So I'm curious where that early stage, high impact capital should come from in community when you think about that, particularly in a place like Detroit that has a lot of these early stage startups.
It's such an interesting question. I think we've actually seen a sea change in the last 4 or 5 years in terms of philanthropy's approach to high risk, early stage, community-based, unproven organizations. It's now part of the equation. You want to get at issues of social justice and equity and racial reconciliation, you gotta permit people on the ground who are just kind of getting their feet to try some stuff. And when you think about philanthropy, a grant is sort of the ultimate total risk thing, right? We're going to lose that money. So don't think about giving them a loan. Don't think about doing an equity investment in these institutions. Give them a grant. Let them try. Let them get going. And in the wake of the George Floyd murder, I think we, as so many other foundations, wanted to try to figure out how we could begin investing in organizations that were not necessarily on our radar. And I think it goes back to the earlier question, is that the only way to crack that, you don't do an RFP and get that kind of result. You got to be on the ground. You've got to talk to people on the ground and say, who are the 5 or 6 organizations who are just kind of getting going, who have huge promise, they're well led, they're really rooted in community, and you ought to take a risk on them by giving them a grant. And that's what we did in Memphis, for example. We helped support a coalition of 50 racial justice organizations, and they became sort of our go-to. They basically said, you know, these guys, you really could use your help. It doesn't need to be much, you know, park it over there. Same thing, New Orleans, the Community Foundation does it. I happen to be a big fan of community foundations sort of working in a next generation way. I mean, I get that donors are going to be really reluctant to do this unless they're particularly enlightened. But, you know, usually donors have their sort of their niches. They want to do the arts or film or whatever it is. But more and more community foundations, I think, are carving out discretionary funds. And it just seems to me that this is the epitome of what a community investment should be, right? It should be in small startup organizations, whether it's a small business or a small social justice organization or a jazz club or whatever it is. But that is where I think place-based philanthropy is so important. It's very hard to get the Ford Foundation or the Kresge Foundation to know enough about a community to make those kinds of investments, but a community foundation ought to. And then I think it begins the process of helping educate its broader community and getting its donors interested. We can't do that. We can't interest the Raleigh Community Foundation's donors in our grants, but the Community Foundation probably could. So I think more and more if it's going to be a philanthropic role, and I think it should be, then I think it needs to reside with the local community foundation.
Rip, before I thank you formally, let me just give a few announcements, and then we'll have a round of applause to you. I'm supposed to say thanks very much for attending the Foundation Impact Research Group seminar with Rip Rapson. The second thing is I'm supposed to say, we hope you will join us for the remaining seminars this spring semester with guest speakers. Next week, actually, we have a special event, February 22nd. Mayor Justin Bibb, the mayor of Cleveland, who's a very interesting guy, is coming for a special talk here on Wednesday, February the 22nd. Justin previously worked in nonprofits. He worked under President Obama, fascinated and deeply interested in diversity and inclusion. That's Wednesday, a week from today, and it will take place at 4:30. Is it 4:30? 4:30 in downstairs in the Commons, and then on March the 8th, Jenny Esposito, who really is the great expert in the country on family philanthropy, she's coming to speak. She started the National Center for Family Philanthropy. On March the 29th, John Palfrey, the president of the MacArthur Foundation, is coming. And then we have a special one on, I'm looking at, I know where, I took the wrong page. It is April the 18th. Barbara Pickauer, who is the head of the JPB Foundation, is going to do a Zoom session, not in person, but that will also be covered. And it will be done from New York, from her apartment there, or office, one or the other. In any event, that's the story for the rest of the semester. Now I'm privileged to thank Rip for coming down and giving a fascinating illustrated talk multiply illustrated talk that I think everybody could really benefit from. Whether it just shows if you do something for adults that worked for children, it might work for adults too. In any event, thank you all for coming. Rip, you've done it again. You can come back and talk about Detroit in 2 years.
Thank you all.